Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God.
I'm Jay.
I'm Fletcher.
And I'm Abby.
And on today's episode of the Story Fulfilled podcast, it is the David special.
Woo, David special.
All about David today. So, as always, we like to encourage you to read the stories for yourselves to get the whole picture. And obviously, with David, we can't talk about everything that there is to talk about. There's so much in there. We have the narrative, and then we also have the Psalms. And I mean, there's just so much. But the bulk of what we're looking at is found in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and even into 1st Kings. So we do encourage you to take time to dig in and read the scriptures. So also, as we like to do, we'd like to start each episode with a question.
Oh, no.
And so today's question, we have David and we have Saul, and they are... they're contemporaries in some way, like they're walking around in the same social circles. And so the question is, if David and Saul were in high school, which high school clique would each of them belong to? Sometimes there's different groups of people that hang out and they're characterized, or like there's a caricature of them. So which cliques would each David and Saul belong to?
All right. Okay. I guess I'll go first if I have an answer. I think for David, he's kind of a shepherd, farmer kind of guy. So I'm going to go with the 4-H club.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
It is. Our cousin was in a 4-H club in high school.
I think he had to bring a
cow.
cow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to lie, guys. I went to high school in Toronto. There was no
There's no
what is
4-H
four?
club.
Do we know what the H's stand for?
Horses, hay.
Okay.
That's it. I got nothing. I have
Horses
no idea.
and hay.
I
Yeah.
have no idea either.
I know it's farming and things. So that's
Yeah.
why I'm going to go for David.
I finished high school in New Brunswick, and we didn't have one of them there either. But
It was the 4-Fish
horses
club.
and hay. The
Yeah, I
4-Fish,
remember
yeah.
watching our cousin Alex. He had this cow, and we were all invited up to go watch him walk this cow around a circle for a competition. It was
So
really
David's going to
funny.
walk his sheep around and then punch a bear.
There we
Jay
go.
likes
Okay,
to
and
say.
what about Saul Fletcher?
Ooh. He kind of seems like a jock. He's taller than everybody.
That's
He's
fair.
handsome.
He was a little bit mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a sword fighting class or something. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Fencing. He's fencing.
Oh, there you go. Fencing.
Okay.
Okay. So I think for David, I'm going to put him in like the poetry club. Or
Okay.
like
Yep.
drama club.
Yeah.
I feel like he would just enjoy that. And then for Saul, I'm going to go with the LARPers, like live action role play.
Yeah, okay. Why?
Because he likes to fight. And I feel like he would get
It's not real fighting in the LARPing club.
Well, I mean, they're hitting each other.
They are. I
They've
guess so.
got
They get
wooden
to
swords
dress
and
up.
stuff. And
Fair enough.
Make their own decisions,
Wow.
I
Great.
think it's good, right?
Okay.
Okay, Jay, your turn.
Okay. So for David, I'm gonna put him. He's in the school band. He's
that's
the high
good.
school
Yeah.
band.
Yeah.
Because he's musical and.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's part of that crowd. And see, Saul, you guys took the good ones, I think, but I guess I have him maybe as like the overly emotional grunge guy. Like I'm thinking of my high school days, like the grunge 90s grunge rock kind of
That's
thing,
funny.
and like those guys.
That's a slightly different route than what we took.
Yeah, but they were like, there's a lot of emotion.
Yes,
That's kind of
true.
even pent up in there, and they've got to get it out. And Saul, he had to get out some of that extra
Yeah.
emotion. So
Throws spears sometimes
That's
too. I hear
funny.
when he's
that's
angry.
it. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
funny. So if you have an answer to that question, or if you have any other questions about the show or the topics that we cover, we'd love to hear from you. So email us at story@bfmc.org.
We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, it's fun.
All right, so today's show is going to be a little bit different than before, and that's because we're covering one of the biggest characters in the Bible, King David. He does a ton of stuff in his time. So I've asked Abby and I've asked Jay what their favorite David stories, and I have my finger quotes up. but you can't see them. What their favorite David stories are, and they're going to be talking about them. And at the end, we're going to be talking about who is coming after David in the royal line.
Yeah, Fletcher gets the big question.
Right. So just before, we'll get a little bit of a background, I guess. These stories take place during the reign of David, which is from 1025 to 970 BC. It takes place in Israel. And then the last story that I'm going to be telling takes place specifically in Jerusalem. This time in Israel, when David is king, when Saul was king, is one of the only times Israel is actually united under a single king. So Saul, David, and Solomon were the only three kings that reigned over all of Israel. Afterward, it was split into Judah and Israel, and they were never actually united again. So, without any ado, we have Jay's story time.
Yeah, so I love the story of when David spares Saul's life. And actually, this happens twice, but the first time that it happens, I find particularly intriguing. So what's happened here is that David has been anointed as king by God, but Saul is still alive. And so this creates a little bit of, as you could expect, some tension. But there's really no tension until the story progresses. So we have the David and Goliath incident. So the Philistines are taunting the armies of Israel, and everyone is afraid, including Saul, who was, as we read, maybe even the same size as Goliath, or at least close to it. He was, in as far as stature goes, the right man for the job. And David comes along and he claims the victory that's already there, that's been given to them in God, because he knows God's promise, and he's treasured God's promise and made them a part of who he is. And so he defeats Goliath, and then from there he becomes a warrior. He does a lot of fighting.
He's like the super famous kind of celebrity in
Yeah,
Israel at the time.
He's a successful war man, and so he's very successful. And Saul becomes jealous. There's this one line that happens where the Israelites are all celebrating victory, and all of the women begin to sing. Saul has slain thousands, David tens of thousands. And if you want to get a man upset, you take away all the attention of the women and place it on another man. And so Saul is like, what? And so he becomes very jealous of David, and he actually tries to kill him several times.
And I like he puts up challenges for David too. At one point he says, "Go get me, 100 Philistine foreskins." And David brings back way more than he was supposed to. And he's like, "Yeah, I can do it.
Yeah,
no problem."
I might have said I'm not the man for that job, but so Saul tries to kill David a number of times. David flees for his life, and so then we find ourselves in 1 Samuel chapter 24. And so as Saul is pursuing David, he finds out that David is in the wilderness in En-Gedi, which is along the western coast of the Dead Sea. And so Saul brings 3,000 men with him to find David, which to me, even in that says something about who he believes David to be. And even what he might even just know about, like knowing that he's actually fighting a futile battle. Like you're fighting against, and David makes this realization before he takes the throne, but Saul might realize, okay, I'm fighting actually against the Lord's anointed. This is someone who the Lord has anointed. And so he brings 3,000 men to find David, and then he sees a cave, and he goes into the cave, and depending on your biblical translation, there are a few things noted there. It may most likely say to relieve himself that he went into the cave. But there might be a little footnote that says literally translated to cover his feet, which is, some people would think, well, that means that he actually went in to take a nap. And so there's actually this internet debate over what actually was happening. Did he go in to take a nap, or did he go in to use the toilet, which didn't exist? And so you do a little bit of internet digging, which I do on these things because, as we've uncovered, I am a nerd. Great. And to cover one's feet is actually a phrase that's actually a euphemism for going to the washroom.
there
And
you
so,
go.
There you go.
so Saul, and this is what I love about the Bible is it records things like that. Like we joked about King Ehud way back, and King Ehud, they thought that he was just in the bathroom and that he was just doing the things that you do in the bathroom. So anyways, all of that is a sidetrack to what's actually the point of the story. So Saul goes into the cave, but he was in a vulnerable position. And so David and his men just happened to be hiding in the very cave that Saul went into, right? And so David's men say to David, "Hey, here you go, man. God has delivered Saul to you. Here's your chance to kill him." And David says that he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. And so he cuts off the corner of Saul's robe. And he actually feels even terrible about what he did, that he would even do this thing to maybe even disrespect or taunt King Saul. And so he makes all of his men stand down and says, we're not doing anything. And so Saul leaves the cave, and then David calls out to him, and he bows before him. I love that because he says, you are still the king. In his actions, he's saying, Saul, you are still the king. And he tells him what he did. And David says to him, I'm not trying to kill you or to take your throne. Like essentially what he's communicating is I am secure in what the Lord has said and what he has set up, and I will submit myself to the Lord's authority. And Saul ends up realizing that David will be actually the king, and he makes David promise him that he won't destroy Saul's line. And so Saul goes home, and David and his men go back to the camp.
I like that Saul talking to David and how nicely David says it. He's like, okay, you know what? The Lord has anointed you. You're going to be king after me. I believe you.
Right.
He's just so humble. Not Saul, David. David is just so humble the entire time. He's like, okay, I'm going to cut this robe just because to get his attention. And then when he does it, he bows first. Tells his man, so humble. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So,
and that's what I love about it is that it just highlights, as I said, it highlights David's trust in the Lord, that he will bring about the things that he said that he will bring about. And it's not in David's timing, it's in God's timing. And so he trusts totally in his plan, which says so much about his character, just in who he is. As Abby said, he's humble and he trusts in the Lord, and he's just willing to allow God to do his thing in his time, to not force things, knowing that forcing things is doing things in your own strength, and that's not what we're called to do. And
Wow.
Great.
It's a great story.
Good story.
I like it.
I'm glad we covered it.
Yeah.
Next up, we have Abby telling the story of Abby.
that's right.
I wonder if she went by Abby ever, if it was always Abigail.
I don't think it's exactly translated, so I don't know if you could.
I think Abigail is a Hebrew name. I don't know.
Maybe it's not pronounced the same, but
Probably
who knows?
not. I don't know. What I actually found funny about this is I knew I was going to talk about Abigail because I can't not talk about Abigail. But Jay, when you picked your story, I didn't realize it was literally the chapter before that story.
Right.
Of course, out of all the stories of David, we picked two right after each other, which is funny. So, a chapter later, so Samuel is now dead, and Saul is still the king. David is very famous, and he just keeps getting more and more popular, which really bugs Saul. There's a large army, but David will not go against Saul still. So this is in 1 Samuel 25. So David is near Maon, which is west of the Dead Sea and a little bit south of Jerusalem, with his men. And he hears about this guy named Nabal, which literally translates to fool. Nabal was a fool. And so while he stayed near Nabal's land, and he was helping him out and whatever. And so he gets tired. It's time to go. And so David sends some of his men to go talk to Nabal, and it's like, hey, we protected your sheep and took care of your people while we were here. Could you give us some food or something? There's feast days right now, and we want some stuff to eat. And so Nabal comes out. He's like, who do you think this is? I don't know who this David is. How do I know that, you guys aren't just servants who ran away and are pretending to be somebody? And And he's like, you guys are just rebellious and you're against Saul and whatever. And so he flat out refuses to give them food.
Because he's a fool.
Because he's a fool. Names mean something. Well, Nabal's wife hears this. Her name's Abigail. And she knows about David, and she knows that he has been anointed by God. And so she hears about it from servants, and she immediately goes out. She makes all these preparations. She gets all these raisin cakes and a bunch of other stuff. I forget all the other stuff. I always remember the raisin cakes.
Lots of food.
Lots of food. And she goes out with some with her servants, and she goes out to David and his men. And she just says, hey, I am so sorry for my husband. She bows down. She's like, I know you're the king, and he is such a fool, just like his name is. And please don't kill me, and please don't kill my family. Like, please accept this gift. And so he's like, okay, that's cool. And he accepts the gift. And then Abigail goes home. Nabal is totally drunk, and he's just eating a lot of food. And so Abigail's like, I'm not going to tell him right now. So the next day when he's sober, she goes up and she's like, yo, yeah, you know that guy David that you that you turned away?
Yeah.
Well, I went and fed him. And basically, 10 days later, he has a stroke and dies.
Wow.
And so David hears about this, and he calls Abigail, and he's like, hey, will you marry me? And she gets excited, and they ride happily ever after into the sunset. So that is
Sort of.
All right.
sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
So the questions that we want to answer is, why do you like this story?
Well, I like her. She's spunky. I like her. She just she knows what's right, and she goes for it anyways. Like she goes against her husband, even though he's supposed to be like in charge or whatever. And she's like, no, I know that God wants David to be here. And so she honors that. And then David again honors her later on. And so when it talks about what it says about David, it shows, I think, that he's true to his promises too.
Right.
Because at first he's like, oh man, I'm going to go kill Nabal, and I promise that like no one will live, right?
Right.
And then Abigail goes and repents and humbles herself, and David's like, oh, you know what? No, like I will listen to you and I will keep the promise. And so it's a man of his word, which I think is really neat. So I like that story.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Is that it? Anything else you want to say about Abigail?
I think that's all I want to say. She's pretty
Abby
great.
claims to be named after Abigail.
Yes, well, ask my parents. That's what they tell me.
All right.
We're really enjoying putting this podcast together, and we hope you are enjoying listening as well. If you are, why don't you like, comment, or leave a review on whichever platform you're using. Feel free to share with your family and friends as well. If you have any questions or comments about the episode, please send us an email at story@bfmc.org.
Yes.
All right. I'm the third story. And I don't know if it's my favorite story, but it is a cool one. And it's kind of, we're going to see who's next in line to be king. So we're skipping forward a bit to David in his old age. He's no longer this young, spunky king who's a big, great warrior and kills people because they didn't give him
Use the
food.
word spunky a lot in this episode.
I like spunky.
It's true. It's true.
So David is now ruling over all of Israel, and he's taken Jerusalem as the capital. And David wants to build this temple to the Lord, but he's told no because he's this man of war. But he's told that his son will actually build the temple, not him. And we see that, well, he marries Abigail here, but he actually has many wives and a lot of kids. So I have a list of the wives and a few of the kids. But the wives are Milcah, and that's Saul's daughter, Abigail, Ahinoam, Maacah, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, and Bathsheba. And there's actually a lot more, and they're unnamed wives and concubines. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he was a man of many women, apparently. Yeah. So here's a list of kind of the kids that are a part of stories in the Bible. He has a ton of children, but here are the ones that are named and have stories: is Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah, Nathan, Solomon, and his only named daughter is Tamar. So we've talked about this before, but we know polygamy is forbidden in the Bible, and David broke that law. We see that.
Yeah,
and that's
looks
a
that
really
way.
common thing to break that law of polygamy. And he did this for political reasons. He married a bunch of daughters of kings, and he also did it for sexual reasons, as you see with the story of Bathsheba.
Yep.
And it actually caused a lot of problems in his life with a lot of children. They all had different mothers, and there was a lot of rivalry growing up. And there was actually some incestual relationships that came out of it. Yeah. So it wasn't a good thing that he had tons of wives, and it actually caused problems for him.
Yep.
And the prophet Nathan even prophesied that because of David's infidelity, that his children would rebel against him and turn, and his wives would be given to other men. And this actually comes true with his son Absalom, who ends up rebelling against him.
Yeah. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is there any time in the Bible where there's somebody who has multiple wives and it's actually a good thing?
Nope.
No.
I'm thinking through them and I'm like, Rebecca and Leah. No, Rachel and Leah.
It's always caused problems. Yeah.
Always.
Yep. And it's never, and sometimes, oftentimes people will maybe even reject the Bible or say, I can't look at the polygamy that's there. And God is for that or whatever, which we never see in Scripture. God saying, "Go take more than one wife."
Mm-hmm.
He never does that.
Yeah. Now, I think he does redeem.
Yeah.
He'll work through it. That's
with
what we see.
Bathsheba and Solomon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is some redemption.
And Rachel and Leah and all this stuff. So he works through it, but that doesn't. He's going to work through everything.
That's true of us and the sin in our lives as well. He redeems us and works through us. But he never ordains polygamy.
And we see also, well, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point, but Solomon had, 700 wives, and he ends
beat
up...
his dad's record.
That's right.
He did. Allegedly. We don't know the number of David's wives, but I don't know if it's in the 700s or hundreds or whatever it is.
It was 700s.
But yeah, Solomon ends up turning away from God.
I just don't understand how, man.
I know.
It's not like one per 2 years.
You can't even spend it one day, yeah.
I get text messages. Did you remember to put the chicken in the crock pot? No. Oops. That's one wife.
700 text messages.
The kids to school today.
Yeah. Well, they go to school. I make sure of that.
Yeah, that's good.
They don't always have their snow pants. Anyways.
Here's the story. So David is now a really old man, and he can't get warm, and he doesn't do anything. He lies in bed. And he hasn't decided who's going to be king after him. So Adonijah, one of his sons, through Haggith, sets himself as the next king without David knowing. He gives himself the chariots and recruits men to go in front of him and walk in front of him. And kind of a description that we get of Adonijah is that David never disciplined him. He did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and he's doing it again as claiming himself to be king. So he takes Joab, who's the leader of the armies, and priests to his side, and they're going to help him become king. Then he invites all of David's sons and all the royal officers to perform sacrifices to celebrate him being king.
Right.
So yeah, they're all at this celebration, and the people that he didn't invite were people that were against him, which is the prophet Nathan, and then a couple other priests, and Solomon, who's David's son. So Nathan jumps into action, and he goes, "Okay, I got to come up with a plan here, otherwise Solomon's going to die probably because he's jealous of him." So he goes, Nathan goes and sees Bathsheba, and they hatch this plan together to go see David and say, "Well, didn't you promise us that Solomon would be king next?" Mm-hmm. So they put it into action, and Bathsheba goes in to see David and says, "Adonijah's set himself up as king, and you don't even know about it, and you promised my son Solomon would be king." And then Nathan comes in right afterwards and goes, "Look, you promised Solomon to be king, and now Adonijah's king. Is this what you want?"
Right.
And he goes, No. Solomon will be king. So then David sends out Solomon with the royal donkey and goes and performs sacrifices. And then Nathan anoints him with oil. And then they ride back into the city with all the royal guards.
Right.
And then the people at Adonijah's party find out, and they all flee. They go, "Oh, no. We're not going to be looking like... traitors."
Right.
So they all flee, and then Adonijah finds out, and he's like, "Oh no." So he runs into the temple and clings onto the horn, which is this mercy thing in the temple that you could ask for mercy to not be killed. And Solomon ends up giving him mercy, which is good. So now Solomon has been anointed king, even though Adonijah said he was king. So it kind of worked together. Nathan acted in time. There's this kind of section in First Chronicles. It's in chapter 22, and it's verse 6 to 10. And it talks about how David had talked to God, and God said that he wasn't going to be the one to build the temple, but your son, he will be named Solomon. He will
Right.
be king, and I will establish his reign in Israel forever.
Yeah.
And he will build the temple, and I'll give him peace in his time.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew, however many years before, that Solomon was supposed to be king.
Yeah.
Yet he kind of put it off.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I like that when people kind of, or Adonijah anyway, tries to take it into his own hands, God's plan is still going to come together no matter like what you're trying to do. Nathan was used by God to do that and to make Solomon king.
So then how does David's story and the story of the people that we talked about today, how does that work towards fulfilling the story of God throughout the rest of the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing. Look, we see David, and we uncovered throughout today's conversation that there were flaws. David had flaws. And so sometimes we see David and we say he was a man after God's own heart, and that's why the line continued through him. But what I think we actually see is that God chose David. God set him apart and said, it will be through you that I will bring my line, or that my line will carry on. And so it just highlights that the work is the Lord's for me, like that. And David knew that. And we see that the when he acted in righteousness, it was because he was acting in a way that identified that God's plan is the good plan and the only plan that we should be following. And so as we see the line continuing through David, what we actually see is that it's God who sustains his plan, and God who continues on in his plan as well. And as we continue to look at the story, we see the line is threatened in a number of ways, and a lot of things happen throughout the history of Israel and David's descendants that could actually put a stop to God's plan, but God continues to make it happen throughout. And he uses people. He uses people for sure. He invites people in and says, hey, I'm going to use you. All you need to do is let me do my thing. And so for me, that's how I see David and his line to follow to continue to fulfill the story.
David's definitely, he's not perfect, but I think the thing that makes him different than other people is he's always willing to do what the Lord wants for him. Yeah. Even when it's really hard, like even with the whole Bathsheba story, right? Like it took a lot, but at the end he's like, I know this is wrong and I know it needs to be made right. With Nathan calling him out, but like still he always did what the Lord wanted for him.
Immediate repentance, right? Like we looked last week at Saul. Saul made justifications and over spiritualized things and said, no, this is good. And David just says, yep, that's on me. Yep. I have sinned against God and God alone, right? And
I think he realized he's never too far gone, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've even though I cheated on my wife and not just that, and, like,
killed somebody and
sexually assaulted somebody, like all these things, like I'm not, like the Lord still loves me and he still wants me. So he's never too far gone.
If you want to read this section, it's 1 Chronicles 22, and it's a conversation that David's having with his son, and he basically passes on this Abrahamic blessing that we've been talking about this whole season.
Right.
He passes it on now to his son Solomon, and he admits, like, God tells him that, no, you're a man of war. You're a man of the blood, basically. And he can't be the one to build the temple. But Solomon is going to be a man of peace. And he's going to be the one allowed to build God's temple. Yeah. So, really cool.
Yeah. Great. Well, I guess that concludes today's episode. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for listening.
Have
Hope
a
you
wonderful
enjoyed.
week.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Yeah.